They watched my barn burn down like it was some backyard barbecue, standing there with full gear, water hoses in hand, just far enough away to prove they had all the tools, just not the permission. My daughter's horse was screaming inside, kicking through the smoke, and my wife was on her knees in the grass, begging someone, anyone, to move. But they didn't. Fire chief gave me that bureaucratic mumble, eyes fixed on the dirt like he was trying to unsee what was right in front of him. Non-compliant property, he said, as if that phrase excused 4 generations of ash now blowing across my face. I hadn't paid $150.00 in HOA dues I never owed, because according to a paperwork shuffle nobody told me about, I was suddenly a part of Riverside Meadows. News to me. A violation that cost my family our barn, our history, and almost the life of my daughter's horse Luna. And just when I thought it couldn't get more grotesque, my phone buzzed with a text from Clarissa Trent, the HOA president who speaks like she's swallowed a law book. Perhaps now you'll understand that our regulations aren't optional. The barn was still burning, Luna was still screaming, and Clarissa? She was still smug. Where are you watching this story from? Drop a comment below, because what Clarissa Trent didn't know when she let that barn burn was she wasn't just lighting wood, she was waking up a sleeping giant, and her neat little kingdom about to come crashing down in ways she never saw coming. Now, before you ask, no, I'm not the kind of man who leaves things to chance. I've got records going back to the Eisenhower administration. Every deed, every zoning map, every tax receipt with my grandfather's handwriting on it. So when I say my land never belonged to her little suburb on a stick operation, I mean it. But Clarissa doesn't deal in truth. She deals in control. And like every tyrant dressed in tailored linen, she talks in policy the way preachers talk in parables. Meanwhile, we're dragging buckets from the pond because the damn fire department won't lift a hose. My son Eli, 6 months out of law school and too young to be jaded, grabbed a garden hose like it was a sword, trying to fight back flames that didn't care about his diploma. My wife Lena was pulling at the barn door like it was welded shut by the devil himself. And me? I called Clarissa. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting for my misery. This is the natural consequence of non-compliance, Mr. Weaver. That was her phrase. Like fire was a fine I deserved. I should have thrown the phone across the field. Instead, I kept her on the line, needing her voice to ground my rage. I told her my land was never part of her HOA, that the boundary change they'd snuck in 3 years ago was illegitimate, that they can't retroactively wrap you into a club you never joined. She laughed. Actually laughed. The county approved our maps, Graham, as if that was holy scripture. And just then, I heard a sound I won't ever forget. Splintering wood. Luna's stall beam cracked. Lena screamed, Eli lunged, and I ran like a man 20 years younger. That's when Peter Callahan showed up. Retired jeweler, this thing's worth more than that $1 million lawn ornament you call a fire engine. He go. We didn't save the whole barn, but we saved the soul of it. Half the roof gone, beams collapsed, but Luna was safe. The front half might be gone, but the back still held our tools, our memories, and, by some miracle, a singed photo of my mom from 1965, smiling through a heat-blistered frame like she knew we'd make it out. After the chaos settled and Peter drove home with his pump still steaming, I sat down on a blackened beam and pulled out the same little notebook I've carried since law school. I wrote 3 words. Justice. Not revenge, because revenge is just anger in a costume. Justice, that's the part where truth finds its legs. That's the part Clarissa Trent forgot. A few minutes later, I got another text. This time from Clarissa herself. Sorry about your barn. Perhaps now would be a good time to discuss selling. Selling? Like the fire was a negotiating tactic. Like my land, my memories, my daughter's near loss was just leverage for her dream development. That's when it hit me. This wasn't over a fence color or missed payment. This was war. I stood up, covered in ash, and something colder than soot resolved. I looked across the smoldering wreckage and saw my son still holding Lena, both of them staring at me like they'd follow wherever I pointed next. I pointed at the house. "Eli, call Jessica Monroe at the Tribune. I want every inch of paper tied to Riverside Meadows on my desk by morning." Clarissa thought this was going to be easy, but she didn't know that when you back a landman into a corner, especially one who practiced environmental law for 30 years, you don't get surrender. You get strategy. My father built that barn in 1948 with war hands and calloused hope. He didn't lay those beams for some HOA queen to turn into kindling for a luxury spa. She wanted submission. What she lit was a signal fire, and she just invited the whole damn valley to watch what happens next. The county planning office smelled like a combination of lost time and stale ambition, bad coffee, burned-out toner, and a faint whiff of despair. Eli and I arrived early enough to beat the patio permit crowd, but not early enough to dodge the tension. The clerk at the front recognized me before I said a word. That's the thing about small towns. When your barn burns down on local news, anonymity's off the table. She gave us a polite, vaguely guilty smile and asked what she could help with. Eli stepped up like a junior attorney in a courtroom he'd been born to walk into. "We'd like access to zoning adjustments filed for Riverside Meadows in the past 5 years. That smile of hers twitched just a bit. Barely, but enough to tell me we'd hit a nerve. I'd seen enough depositions to know when someone's hiding something under the laminate. She led us to a dusty workstation with an old monitor and handed over login credentials like they might explode. Eli's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up maps and amendments, clicking through data while I stood back and watched the weight of bureaucracy try to make itself invisible. The original development map, dated 7 years prior, clearly showed the boundary of Riverside Meadows ending just outside our southern fence line, but a revision dated exactly 3 years ago pulled a little magic trick. Our land and 5 other long-owned properties now fell inside the HOA's jurisdiction. No vote, no notice, no warning, just a line drawn quietly through livelihoods and memories, like someone tracing over a chalk outline. And the signature approving that change? Gerald M. Keyes. Same man who stood frozen while my barn turned into an inferno, now wearing a different badge but serving the same queen. I took a breath and stared at that name like it owed me money. "You ever get one of these?" Eli asked, pointing to a list labeled Certified Notification Recipients. I looked. My name was there, bold as brass. "Never saw it," I replied, "and I keep every piece of mail related to this land like it's a tax return from heaven." He nodded slowly, already snapping photos with his phone. "That's procedural violation 1. They claim due process, but this shows deliberate exclusion." I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it wasn't surprising. This whole operation had the stench of backroom real estate deals and HOA fantasy leagues. "They thought no one would check," I said. "Or they thought we were too tired to care. But they'd made a mistake. They'd tried to wrap us into a scheme without realizing we still knew how to untangle paper." While Eli kept digging, I wandered over to the public record printer and picked up a thick packet labeled Riverside Development. Proposed Addendum, Phase 3. Phase 3 was real estate developer code for "You're about to lose your view." It showed a luxury development plan so glossy it might as well have come with a bottle of Chardonnay and a brochure for Botox, spa, golf course, upscale retail, and smack in the middle, a circular lake feature labeled Silverbrook Central. That was our pond, the one behind the barn. The one my grandfather had dredged by hand in 1951 when the water table dropped and cattle were dying. "They've already mapped it," I muttered. "Our pond, our ranch, already drawn into their little utopia. And we were just the last domino to fall." Or so they thought. Jessica Monroe called us just as we were walking out, her voice crisp as ever. "I've been looking into Clarissa's financing," she said. "You'll want to see what I found." We met at a run-down cafe near the highway, one of those places where the waitress calls you "hun" and the coffee tastes like it was brewed through a radiator. Jessica laid out her files like a blackjack dealer with nothing to lose. "She's leveraged," she began. Badly. Montgomery Properties is bleeding cash, and this Silverbrook Grand Resort, it's not just a project, it's a lifeline. She showed us investor reports, loan extensions, private capital raises with interest rates that could make a loan shark blush. She needs this resort to happen, Jessica said. Without your land, it's toast. I leaned over the plans. They'd rendered our ranch in high-res fantasy. Ornamental fencing, solar lighting, walking paths by the pond. In this future, we didn't exist. Our land was labeled pending acquisition. We weren't a family anymore. We were a footnote in a marketing deck. She thinks we'll sell out, I said, more to myself than anyone. Jessica slid over a smaller document. This one's interesting. It shows who's behind the resort funding. Olympus Development Corporation. The name made me pause. Olympus was known for one thing: water rights. Buying up land over aquifers, draining communities dry, and moving on like a legal plague. So, this isn't just about Clarissa, Eli said, brows furrowed. It's about the water, Jessica nodded. Your ranch sits on the recharge zone for the Lower Pine Aquifer. That pond of yours, it's not just pretty, it's strategic. That hit me like a second arson. My family thought we were dealing with HOA harassment. Turns out, we were sitting on a liquid gold mine, and Clarissa was just the front. The more we looked, the more it made sense. The sudden interest in our fence color, the anonymous complaints, the fire chief refusing to act. It wasn't personal, it was profit. Back at the truck, Eli sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through county records with the intensity of a man trying to undo a time bomb. They buried the truth in plain sight, he said. All of it right there, just under fancy logos and rubber stamps. I stared out at the fading sun and thought about my father. About how he used to say, land's not just dirt, son, it's memory with roots. And now someone wanted to pave that over with a parking lot and call it progress. I gripped the steering wheel. They can file all the paperwork they want, I said, but they're not getting this land, not without a fight. Jessica's voice rang in my head. Without your land, the resort's dead on arrival. It sounded like leverage. It sounded like hope. But most importantly, it sounded like purpose. Because now I understood. We weren't victims. We were the keystone. And without us, their empire of glass would shatter. Clarissa Trent thought she was playing Monopoly with hayfields. But she didn't know we were still holding the deed and the receipts. And we were just getting started. If this story hit close to home, or you know someone staring down an HOA from hell, share this video with them, because sometimes the best defense is just knowing you're not alone. And leave a comment, will you? I want to hear what you think of all this, especially if you've lived through your own HOA horror show. The first violation notice came 2 days after our trip to the county office. Grass exceeds regulated height for suburban properties. It would have been funny if it weren't stapled to the same wooden fence my grandfather built in 1949. The next morning we got another. Unauthorized structure on rear lot, barn condition under review. Then came the third. Improper fence color, non-conforming livestock, unsanctioned tool set. You'd think we were running a pirate ship, not a working ranch. By the end of the week, Lena had stacked the citations like a deck of oversized playing cards. They're trying to drown us in paperwork, she said, not even looking up from the growing pile. When they can't beat you with logic, they drown you in paper cuts. I'd argued zoning codes for 30 years and never seen them used like a hammer wrapped in red tape. But Clarissa Trent didn't want a legal win, she wanted a psychological one. That's what made it personal. Then the bank letter came. Mortgage under review due to non-compliant property usage. Pine Valley Community Bank, where we'd held our loan for 15 years without a single late payment, suddenly couldn't remember how fond they used to be of the Weavers. The letter was cold, sterile, like a legal autopsy. A little footnote at the bottom mentioned that our property's usage status had been flagged by a report filed through Community Oversight Review. Translation: Clarissa had sicked her banker friends on us, And guess who was sitting pretty as the regional loan director? Stephen Durant. We'd seen his name in Jessica's research. He'd sunk money into the resort project through a shell group called Greenfield Land Partners. I called it what it was, laundering greed through a zip code. Eli read the notice twice, then snapped a photo like it was a crime scene. "They're trying to bleed us through the bank," he muttered. "Make it look like the land's too risky to hold." I nodded. They're trying to make selling look like the smart option, but they didn't know. Weavers don't sell. We dig in. Things got worse. Our irrigation system, a decades-old setup powered by gravity-fed pumps from the creek, was sabotaged one night. Pipes cracked, control box pried open and gutted. Lena found it early the next morning, the water spraying out of a sheared line like it was trying to scream. Replacing it would cost thousands. But that wasn't the worst part. Our new security system, which I'd upgraded after the fire, had caught a familiar figure lurking near the shed just before midnight. Thomas Avery, Clarissa's vice president and her most loyal paper pusher. Grainy footage, but clear enough. Eli paused the video and looked at me. "You think it was a message?" I nodded. Of course it was. They want us to know it's them, but not enough to prove it. The kind of violence that hides behind plausible deniability. It wasn't just our ranch under siege. It was our resolve. And then came the call from Claire, my daughter, college sophomore, future veterinarian. She was crying. "Dad, someone from financial aid just told me my scholarship is under review." I sat down hard in my desk chair. Under review? They said it was about community standing, that something had come up that might affect continued eligibility. My jaw clenched so tight I could feel my molars grinding. The scholarship she'd earned with 4 years of perfect grades, volunteer work, and the grit of a ranch kid who bottle-fed calves at 5 a.m. in winter. Now held hostage by whispers. Lena overheard, stepped into the room, and didn't say a word. She just picked up the violation notices and started sorting them like a forensic accountant. "They're laying the groundwork," she said, "to paint us as chronic violators, justify the pressure, undermine our credibility, and now, apparently, punish our kids." The rage in her voice was quiet, but it burned hotter than the barn fire. There's no handbook for how to fight an enemy that hides behind paper. But we were about to write one. By the time Jessica showed up with new findings, our kitchen looked like a war room, walls covered in printed documents, zoning maps, violation notices, and now, mortgage clauses. She laid out more: emails between Durant and Clarissa, calls between Avery and planning officials, and a curious memo from Pine Valley's Department of Code Enforcement that mentioned preliminary declassification of legacy agricultural parcels. I stared at that line like it was a rattlesnake under the rug. "They're trying to erase our zoning," I whispered. Eli's face drained. "Dad, if they reclassify us as suburban, we lose water rights, livestock privileges, everything." He grabbed his laptop and started typing furiously. "They're rewriting the map in real time, and once it's done, the records become historical and harder to challenge." I looked at Lena, who had stopped mid-sentence. "They're not just pushing us out," she said. "They're rewriting us out of existence." And that was the moment the paper cuts stopped bleeding and turned into sharpened steel. There's a unique kind of betrayal in watching institutions you once trusted become weapons. The bank we helped build with decades of deposits, the zoning board we'd volunteered with during drought mitigation talks, even Claire's college, which had named her as one of its rising leaders just 2 semesters ago, all of them now complicit or cowardly, or both. That night, I walked out to the edge of our land and looked back at the house, its porch light still glowing, the barn's skeleton outlined against the moonlight, our fields damp from a makeshift irrigation fix. This wasn't just land. This was legacy. They wanted it parceled, papered, and processed, but we were going to turn every sheet of paper into evidence, every notice, every fine, every leaked memo. It was all not for another fire, for the truth. We were assembling our own network now. Jessica kept digging, Lena contacted environmental watchdogs. Eli filed freedom of information requests like a man possessed. And me? I called a favor from someone I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, a former zoning commission chair with a grudge against Clarissa that ran deeper than our creek. I sent him the records, the maps, the video footage. His reply came in 2 words. But we weren't. Not yet. Because if Clarissa wanted a war of attrition, she was about to learn the Weavers didn't break from pressure. We pressurize back. This wasn't just about saving our land. It was about exposing a system that only works when good people stay quiet. And if this part of the story reminds you of your own fight against an HOA, a bank, a bureaucracy that forgot your name, share this video with someone who needs to know they're not crazy or alone, and leave a comment down below. I'm reading every one of them. Because this fight? It's bigger than one ranch. It's about every piece of paper ever used to silence the people who actually built the land beneath it. The next morning, Eli burst into my office, face pale, laptop open. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking just enough to mean something big had just dropped. "They're trying to erase our zoning status from the county archives." I looked up slowly. This wasn't just retaliation anymore. It was deletion. And it meant we had to move faster than they could bury the truth. The thing about land is, it's not always what's on top that matters. Sometimes the real power's buried beneath it, quiet and steady, like the people who've tended it for generations. Lena came into the kitchen that night with a thick folder in one hand and a storm in her eyes. "It's the water," she said flatly. "That's what they're after." She laid out documents from an old colleague at the State Environmental Agency. Hydrology maps, flow patterns, recharge data. Turned out our ranch sat right on top of the Pine Ridge Recharge Zone, an underground aquifer that fed not just our town, but half the farming valley to the east and at least 2 neighboring counties. That little pond Clarissa wanted to turn into a decorative water feature, it wasn't for aesthetics, it was a valve to control a living artery beneath the state. And suddenly, all the zoning changes, the sabotage, the fake fines made perfect sense. They didn't just want the land. They wanted the wellspring. I walked out to the porch, sat down with that folder in my lap, and thought about how many times my father said, "We're not owners, son, we're stewards." I'd always nodded, but now it felt different. Like I'd been handed a key to something sacred, and someone else was trying to pick the lock. Lena joined me, leaned on the railing, and said softly, "They're not just gambling with our family's future. They're risking everyone." And that's when I realized the gloves were coming off. I told her what I hadn't told anyone, not even Eli. 5 years ago, after retiring from law, I was quietly appointed to the State Environmental Land Board. The governor, an old client of mine, had offered the seat as a form of recognition. Light-duty, quarterly meetings, mostly ceremonial. But the board had teeth and jurisdiction. Over development permits, over aquifers, over watersheds. And with the documents Lena had just handed me, I had more than opinion, I had cause. It was time to stop playing defense. Eli stared at me like I'd just confessed I was a secret agent. "You're on the board?" He blinked. "Why didn't you say anything?" I smiled. I thought I was done fighting. Turns out, retirement's overrated. We spent the next 12 hours gathering everything. Scientific records, legal boundary maps, screenshots of threats. And me, I made one quiet phone call to the board's executive director and said 8 words. "I'm requesting emergency review of Pine Valley's watershed." His response was short. "We'll convene, send everything." That night, while Clarissa was probably sipping wine and toasting to another inch of stolen dirt, I was watching our printer spit out copies of her undoing. Her empire had been built on a puddle of lies. And the rain was coming. Clarissa's next move came fast and loud. Eviction order, signed by a county judge who played golf with her board of directors. The paperwork arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, hand-delivered by a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We have 72 hours," Eli read, "to vacate for noncompliance and safety hazard." I could feel Lena's pulse from across the room. That was the moment Jessica called, breathless. "Get your cameras ready," she said. "You're about to get visitors." And, sure enough, Clarissa pulled up in a black SUV like she was filming a reality show. Hair perfect, heels sharp, entourage in tow. She stepped onto her porch, smiled like a rattlesnake in pearls, and said, "Still think this is worth it, Mr. Weaver?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because right then Peter Callahan, former judge and savior of our barn, rolled up waving a court document of his own. "Federal injunction," he shouted, handing it to the deputies. "Issued this morning. You're done here." Clarissa's smile cracked for the first time. The media caught it all, every twitch, every word. Later that day, my emergency request was formally accepted by the Environmental Land Board. Review teams were dispatched, a press release went out statewide, and the resort project? Temporarily frozen. That's the thing about truth. It takes time, but when it hits like a landslide. Jessica's footage ran that night, and suddenly, Clarissa wasn't just a powerful HOA figure. She was the villain in a water war. Headlines read, "Watershed or Wasteland, Luxury Resort Sparks Environmental Alarm." Emails poured in, calls from activists, messages from other homeowners who'd been pushed, bullied, fined into silence. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I found a moment of clarity. I stood at the edge of our pond, looking down at the reflection of sky and cedar trees, and whispered to no one, "This isn't about property anymore. This is about power. And we've got the kind that runs underground." And for the first time in weeks, I smiled, not because we'd won, but because we'd finally drawn a line they couldn't move. Her lawyers may have owned the town, the judge, the bank, even the fence height committee, but they didn't own the water. And they sure as hell didn't own the law. We were no longer the ones being investigated. We were the ones launching the inquiry. Scientists submitted findings. Our cameras kept rolling. Eli prepared legal filings, Lena sent environmental reports up the chain, and Clarissa, she kept showing up to meetings in designer suits, not realizing her kingdom was already eroding under her heels. And if you're still with us through this story, share it with someone you know who's up against their own Clarissa, because these battles aren't rare, they're just rarely talked about. And leave a comment below. Tell me where you're from, tell me what you've seen. Because stories like this, they're only powerful when they echo. And something tells me this echo's just getting started. Next up, we find out just how far Clarissa's willing to go. Because if you thought eviction was her last move, wait till you see what she does when she realizes we've got the water, and now the law. You can always tell when someone's about to do something stupid. They get quiet first. Not calm, just too quiet. Like a rattlesnake right before it strikes. That's how it felt the night after the injunction stopped. Clarissa's eviction stunt cold. No new notices, no phone calls, no bank emails, just silence. That eerie kind of calm you hear right before a storm breaks something expensive. Lena noticed it first. "She's planning something," she said. "She doesn't pause unless she's winding up." Turns out, she wasn't wrong. At 2:14 a.m., our motion sensor tripped. The feed showed a man in tactical boots moving like he'd practiced. Broad shoulders, military haircut, flashlight beam low and deliberate. And he wasn't there to inspect our fence. I looked at Lena and Eli and said one word. "Showtime." See, after the irrigation sabotage and the fake eviction order, I'd installed a second layer of cameras. Military grade, night vision, hidden inside birdhouses, toolboxes, even a fake electric meter. It was overkill for a ranch, but not for a ranch under siege. The guy in the feed was methodical. Disabled the obvious cameras, checked for locks, tested door frames. What he didn't know was that every word he muttered and every step he took was being recorded from angles he couldn't see. I recognized him within minutes. Reed Donovan. Former special ops turned private security for clients who preferred results over paperwork. Jessica had flagged him weeks earlier as one of Clarissa's recent hires. Now he was standing on our back porch thinking we were asleep. I looked at Eli. "Get the sheriff on the line. Quiet channel, no sirens." Then I slipped into the kitchen, turned off the lights, and waited. He broke in like he'd done it before, fast, controlled, almost polite. I made sure I was visible, alone, and holding nothing but a mug. "You must be Clarissa's cleanup man," I said, voice steady but just shaky enough to play the part. He blinked. Didn't expect that. "Mr. Weaver," he said, closing the door softly behind him. "This isn't personal. I'm just here to send a message." He pulled a small handgun, not aimed, present. Like punctuation in a threat. I backed up slightly, palms up. "You don't have to do this," I said. "Clarissa's already lost. The state's reviewing everything." He shook his head. "She says you're still a threat. Says you've got documents that could ruin her." I tilted my head. "You think I'd keep that kind of insurance on paper? I've got digital copies, out there. Safe." He narrowed his eyes. "Then give me access, passwords. I walk out. No one gets hurt." And that's when I started feeding him questions. Not resistance, curiosity. "What's she paying you for this?" I asked. "You military guys don't come cheap," he smirked. 50 grand. Offshore. She's got accounts in the Caymans under a Shell LLC. "I don't ask questions, Mr. Weaver. I solve problems." What he didn't know, besides being filmed from 5 different angles, was that a recording device in the vent above us was catching every word in high fidelity. Sheriff Bennett and 2 deputies were listening from their parked truck at the edge of the property. Eli was relaying every line, Lena monitoring cameras from the upstairs office. It was like a courtroom, a sting, and a documentary all in one. And me, I just had to keep him talking. I leaned against the counter, pretending to tremble. "So what happens now? You take the gun and make it look like an accident?" He shrugged. "Clarissa didn't say how, just that you needed to be handled. She's desperate, Mr. Weaver. She's got investors breathing down her neck, the land, the water. This isn't just development, it's survival." That's when the pantry door flew open and Sheriff Bennett stepped out like the punctuation mark on a confession. "That's enough, Donovan," he said, sidearm raised. "Hands where we can see 'em." Reed spun, startled, but didn't resist. 2 deputies followed, cuffing him while Eli read Miranda rights from memory. I stood there in the dark, my coffee now cold, but my blood warm. "You picked the wrong ranch," I said softly, "and the wrong man to threaten." Reed's arrest made the morning news before Clarissa could pour her coffee. Jessica released a clip of his confession, edited down for maximum impact. The HOA board scrambled to release a statement, claiming no knowledge of his hiring. Clarissa went silent. No interviews, no appearances, just her SUV spotted leaving the HOA office at dusk. That's where we showed up next, with a legal search warrant signed by Judge Callahan himself, and a camera crew rolling for transparency. Eli led the charge, reciting legal protocol like a preacher with purpose. Inside Clarissa's private office, behind a tacky landscape painting, we found a wall safe. Combination? Supplied willingly by one very nervous board member looking to save his own hide. Inside the safe were HOA minutes that had never been approved, maps with fake owner signatures, payment ledgers, and one particularly damning contract. The deal was between Montgomery Holdings, Clarissa's shell company, and Olympus Development International, a corporate hydra known for quietly acquiring water-rich land across the West. The fine print spelled it out. Olympus would fund 80% of the resort if Clarissa could secure uninterrupted access to the aquifer beneath Pine Valley. A handwritten note from Olympus's vice chair read, "Lancaster property, now Weaver, is essential. Without pond rights, do not proceed." That was the smoking gun. This wasn't about fences or barns or even money. This was water war disguised as luxury development. "She thought she was holding the winning hand," I said to Eli, holding the contract between 2 fingers like it smelled bad. Turns out, we swapped the deck. And now, she was out of cards. That evening, Lena placed a small printout on our fridge. It was a quote from one of my old speeches at the Environmental Law Summit. Sometimes the pen really is mightier, especially when the sword's dumb enough to brag on camera. We laughed for the first time in weeks. Not because it was over, it wasn't, but because now we had proof. Taped, filed, and backed by law. Reed's confession, the contract, the fake minutes, the surveillance footage, all of it was being compiled into a formal case. State investigators were coming. Olympus reps were already pulling out of the deal. And Clarissa? Well, her lawyers might still own half the town, but the water? That was ours. And the law? It just came knocking on her door. If you've stuck with us this far, thank you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been bullied into silence by paperwork and power, and drop a comment below. Because these fights aren't rare, they're just rarely recorded from 5 angles and served with a side of poetic justice. And trust me, we're just getting warmed up, because now we know who we're really up against. Clarissa wasn't the storm, she was the umbrella. The storm? That's just starting to roll in. It's a strange thing to watch someone who once terrified an entire community get cuffed in silk pajamas. Clarissa Trent was arrested at 6:17 a.m. on a Thursday. She didn't go quietly. The footage captured by Jessica's cameraman showed her storming down her brick walkway, screaming about being framed and threatening to sue anyone with a camera. But the evidence spoke louder than her lawyers. Between Reed Donovan's confession, the Olympus contracts, and the HOA records we'd unearthed, there wasn't much left to spin, especially after 3 board members flipped faster than a pancake at a fundraiser. Turns out most of them didn't even know they were on the board. Some were real people, others not so much. One signature belonged to a woman who'd been dead since 2006. Another came from a treasurer named Milton Yates, who turned out to be a Labrador retriever registered to a member's son as a joke. Clarissa forged meeting minutes, fabricated votes, and manufactured consent like it was just another spreadsheet. She didn't run a homeowners association. She ran a one-woman puppet show. The trial made national news within a week. The media called it the HOA that went too far, but that didn't even scratch the surface. As the hearings unfolded, the real story emerged, a scheme to weaponize community policy in order to control regional water access. Olympus Development was subpoenaed and tried to play innocent, but the paper trail told a different story. Their name was on too many documents. Their fingerprints were all over the aquifer acquisition maps. Once their private communications leaked, especially the ones calling Pine Valley a strategic rural capture zone, they started backing away like someone caught holding fireworks next to a dry barn. By the 3rd week, Olympus had withdrawn from the Silverbrook Grand Resort project entirely. Their PR team went on a full apology tour, and their investment partners dropped them like a bad hat. Clarissa? She sat in court every day in a muted pantsuit, her signature smirk replaced with something halfway between panic and disbelief, like she still couldn't believe the rules had finally applied to her. When the state legislature called me to testify, I wore the same boots my father gave me when I took over the ranch. I wasn't there to grandstand. I was there to finish the job. My testimony focused on the abuse of HOA power, the manipulation of zoning laws, and the systemic vulnerability of landowners who don't have lawyers in the family. Eli sat behind me, Lena beside him, Jessica a few rows back, with a recorder in her lap. When it was over, the committee asked if I had a recommendation. I told them the truth. We don't need to reinvent the law. We just need to enforce it where the soil's been loosened by greed. 2 months later, the governor signed the Weaver Act, legislation requiring unanimous consent and direct, recorded notification before any HOA can expand its jurisdiction to legacy agricultural parcels. The law passed with bipartisan support. Turns out, both sides of the aisle don't like getting hoodwinked out of water. Our ranch was declared a historic conservation site by the state land board shortly after. A team of hydrologists confirmed the recharge zone beneath our soil fed into 4 separate municipalities and sustained nearly 18,000 residents across the region. A plaque now stands at the front gate, Weaver Ranch, protected by law, sustained by legacy. But to us it's just home. The barn's been rebuilt, the fields are strong, the pond's quiet again. Lena's turned half the property into an ecological research site. And Claire? Her scholarship was reinstated, with an apology letter from the university's board. She framed it, right next to her vet school acceptance letter. These days, people drive by just to see the place where it all happened. Some stop to shake my hand, others just honk and wave. We used to be that family with the horse. Now we're the family that stood up. Either way, we didn't move. And we didn't sell. Olympus eventually left the state entirely. Too many investigations, too much heat. But they didn't disappear. That's why we stayed loud. Jessica's 4-part exposé won a journalism award, and her footage helped inspire similar lawsuits in 3 other states. Communities started asking questions about their own HOAs, about quiet rezoning, about who actually benefits when the grass height is policed, but not the water table. You'd be amazed what starts growing once the weeds are pulled. Our little war triggered a state-level audit of homeowner associations, and what came back was equal parts tragedy and farce. One HOA had bylaws that banned nail colors deemed disruptive to visual harmony. Another had spent $8,000, 0 cents of community funds, on steak dinners and decorative landscape psychology. We were lucky. We caught it early. But most folks don't have time to read fine print until the sheriff's already knocking. That's why stories matter. They called us holdouts, obstinate, backward, anti-progress. But turns out we were the dam holding back a flood of corruption. And we didn't break. We held. The town's changed now. Mayor Simmons resigned after it came out he'd accepted campaign donations funneled through a consulting firm tied to Clarissa's project. His replacement? A young former journalist who ran on transparency and community rights. I didn't vote for him because of party lines. I voted because he showed up and asked questions, real ones. When the ribbon was cut on the new town water policy task force, he asked me to speak. I kept it short. You can't price tag legacy. You inherit it or you lose it. And the second you treat neighbors like obstacles instead of stewards, you've already lost the land. Got a standing ovation. Probably the first time anyone clapped in that meeting room since 1993. And now the story lives on, not just in our soil, but in school textbooks, law journals, and a little metal sign that says, "Preserved by people who refuse to be pushed." Ellie teaches environmental law part-time, still works the ranch the rest. Lena's lab just received a grant to study aquifer resilience. And me? I sit on my porch, drink my coffee, and watch the sunrise hit the pond like it's saluting back. Occasionally, someone from another state calls me, asks how we did it. I tell them the truth. It starts by not leaving, because that's what Clarissa never understood. She thought she could outpaper us, outfund us, outlast us. But she forgot one thing. We had the truth, and we had time. And that's the part she never planned for. And if you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Not just for listening to my family's story, but for caring about what it means. This wasn't just about a barn or a fence or even a corrupt HOA president. It was about what we're willing to stand up for when everything we love gets buried in red tape and power games. It was about proving that truth doesn't need a PR team. It just needs a little daylight and a few folks brave enough to hold the line. Because here's the truth. Every community has its own Clarissa. Sometimes it's a developer. Sometimes it's a policy. Sometimes it's just silence pretending to be order. But this story? It's proof that one voice can start a ripple, one family can spark a movement, and one old ranch with a stubborn past can help change laws, protect water, and remind people that legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you defend. And before you go, I've got a question for you. What would you like me to cover next? What stories matter to you? Have you lived through a battle like this, or seen something that needs to be told? Drop it in the comments. Seriously. This channel isn't just about telling stories, it's about telling yours. And the more you share, the stronger this community gets. Because when you shape what comes next, you're not just a viewer, you're part of the story. So don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world or your neighborhood. Let's keep building this together.